If you've ever felt like people looked at you and saw a threat before they saw a person, this story is for you. And if it moves you even a little, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe before you keep watching, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by more people than just us. Because what happened on a warm September evening in the small town of Millbrook wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would force an entire community to look in the mirror. And it started with something as simple as a wedding. Marcus Webb had been a police officer for 22 years. He remembered the exact day he pinned on his first badge, fresh out of the academy at 24 years old, so proud he could barely breathe. He also remembered, 3 weeks later, being pulled over by a fellow officer from a neighboring precinct while off duty, made to sit on the curb in his own neighborhood while his badge sat useless in his glove compartment because the officer hadn't bothered to ask before assuming. Marcus never forgot how it felt to be seen as suspicious before he was seen as a person. He carried that memory with him through every promotion, every commendation, every year he spent working his way up through patrol, then detective, then captain, until 11 years ago, the City Council of Millbrook made him the first black police chief in the town's 140-year history. It hadn't been an easy road. There were council members who fought his appointment behind closed doors. There were longtime residents who called the local paper to complain, without ever quite saying what they meant. There were officers under his command who tested him in ways they never would have tested a white chief, questioning his decisions publicly, slow-walking his directives, waiting for him to fail. Marcus met all of it the same way he met everything, with patience, with competence, and with a quiet refusal to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Over a decade, crime dropped, community trust scores rose, and even his fiercest early critics grudgingly admitted that Millbrook had never been safer. But Marcus knew that respect earned in a boardroom didn't always follow a man home. It didn't follow him to the grocery store, where clerks sometimes watched him a beat too long. It didn't follow him to open houses, where realtors sometimes steered him toward more affordable neighborhoods without being asked. And as he would soon learn, it didn't automatically follow him onto his own wedding day. He met Jasmine Bennett 4 years earlier at a community fundraiser for the local library, of all places. She was a school teacher, sharp-tongued and warm in the same breath, the kind of woman who could disarm a room with a joke and then turn around and organize a fundraiser that outperformed every projection. She had grown up in Millbrook too, in a family that had lived on the same quiet country road for 3 generations. The Bennett farmhouse, with its wraparound porch and its acres of green lawn, had hosted every family holiday Jasmine could remember. When Marcus proposed to her on that same porch 2 years later, down on one knee in the spot where her grandparents had taken their own wedding photos decades before, Jasmine didn't hesitate for a second. Planning the wedding had been its own kind of joy. Jasmine's mother, Patricia, everyone called her Miss Pat, took charge of the guest list with the precision of a general, while Marcus handled logistics with the same calm efficiency he brought to running a police department. They chose the Bennett family farmhouse for the ceremony itself, wanting something intimate, something rooted in Jasmine's history. They rented a white tent for 120 guests, strung cafe lights across the lawn, hired a young DJ named Trey who came recommended by half the church choir, and sent out invitations on cream cardstock that Jasmine had designed herself. What neither of them accounted for was Sandra Kessler. Sandra had lived next door to the Bennett family for 6 years, ever since she and her husband retired from the city and bought the property specifically for its quiet. In those 6 years, she had spoken to Miss Pat perhaps a dozen times, a wave over the fence, a brief exchange about a stray dog, nothing more. She wasn't an unkind woman, not by her own accounting. She donated to charities. She recycled diligently. She would have been offended, deeply and sincerely, if anyone had ever called her prejudice to her face. But when she looked out her kitchen window that September evening and saw a caravan of unfamiliar cars lining the road, a white tent glowing with lights, and dozens of black faces in formal wear moving across the lawn she'd grown used to seeing empty, something old and unexamined stirred in her, something she would have described only as unease if pressed, though unease was doing a great deal of quiet work. By the time the DJ played the third song, the bass thumping pleasantly across the lawn, Sandra had already convinced herself she was doing the responsible thing. She dialed the non-emergency police line and described, in careful, reasonable-sounding language, a large, unfamiliar gathering and loud music late in the evening, and cars she didn't recognize. She did not mention that the wedding had a permit. She did not mention that she hadn't bothered to walk over and ask. She hung up the phone feeling, for a moment, like a good citizen protecting her quiet street. 40 minutes into the reception, 2 patrol cars turned up the long gravel driveway. Marcus saw the lights first, the way he'd trained himself to see everything first. Some old instinct refusing to fully retire even on his wedding day. He watched two young officers step out and start up the drive, and for one disorienting second, he was simultaneously the groom in a rented tuxedo and the chief who had trained half the bar department on de-escalation and implicit bias just 18 months earlier. The music died as Trey, sensing the shift in the air, killed the speakers without being asked. 120 guests went quiet all at once, the particular quiet of people who had seen this story before and knew, with a sinking certainty, how it usually ended. Miss Pat stepped forward first, her voice even and practiced, the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to stay calm in rooms that wanted her to be anything else. She explained that this was her daughter's wedding, that they had a permit, that they had called ahead about the noise ordinance weeks in advance. The taller officer, young enough to have been in middle school when Marcus made detective, asked politely but firmly for identification from whoever was hosting. That was when Marcus set down his glass and walked forward. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. He introduced himself by name first, Marcus Webb. "This is my wedding." And only then, watching the recognition arrive in the officer's face like a slow sunrise, did he reach into his jacket and produce the badge he'd carried, out of habit, even to his own reception. The younger officer's composure cracked instantly, a mixture of horror and disbelief passing over his features as he realized exactly whose celebration he'd been sent to interrupt. But Marcus didn't spend that moment on the officers. He turned instead toward the property line, where Sandra Kessler stood on her porch in her bathrobe, arms crossed, watching a scene she had set in motion now curdle in front of 120 witnesses. He asked, evenly, who had called it in, and every head under that tent turned in the same direction at once. Sandra came down when the officer asked her to, because refusing would have made the truth even more obvious than it already was. She stammered through an explanation about not recognizing the cars, about the music being loud, about not knowing whose party it even was, and every sentence she offered only sharpened the shape of what she'd actually meant, which was that a lawn full of black faces in formal wear had looked, to her, less like a celebration and more like a problem that needed solving. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. He told her, without cruelty but without softening it either, that next time, before calling in 120 people as a disturbance, she might try knocking on the door first. He told her they would have gladly saved her a slice of cake. Somewhere in the crowd someone laughed, a short, startled bark of a laugh, and it rippled, backward through the guests until even 80-year-old Aunt Rochelle was wiping tears from her eyes. Sandra's face went the color of the tablecloths, and she mumbled something that might have been an apology before retreating back across the property line she spent 6 years treating as a wall against her neighbors rather than a boundary between them. The two officers, visibly relieved to have an exit, apologized to Marcus directly and offered their sincere congratulations before driving back down the gravel road. Marcus watched them go, then turned back to Jasmine, standing in the farmhouse doorway in the dress her mother had spent 8 months altering, her expression somewhere between fury and disbelief and, underneath it all, a fierce protective love for the man she'd just married. He crossed the lawn, took her hand, and told Trey to turn the music back on. What happened next was the part of the story that Millbrook would talk about for years. Not the phone call, not the cruisers, not even Marcus's badge catching the string lights as he held it up. What people remembered was that the reception didn't end there. Marcus and Jasmine danced until well past midnight. Aunt Rochelle taught 3 teenagers the electric slide. Miss Pat cried happy tears into her cake. The 120 guests who had gone silent under that tent 40 minutes earlier spent the rest of the night refusing to let one small, ugly moment define their whole day. But the story didn't end at midnight either. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened spread through Millbrook the way these things do, first through the church, then through the grocery store, then eventually into the local paper, which ran a short piece under the headline that would later travel far beyond the town's borders. Sandra Kessler, mortified by the attention, wrote a letter to the local paper that was, by most accounts, the closest thing to genuine self-reflection anyone in town had seen from her. She didn't try to explain away what she'd done. She admitted, in writing, that she had made an assumption about people she had never bothered to meet, and that the assumption said more about her than it ever could have said about them. Some in town found the apology too little, too late. Others saw it as the beginning of something. Jasmine, for her part, said only that she hoped Sandra meant it, and that either way, she wasn't going to let the woman rent space in her head on top of everything else. Marcus used the moment, as he used most moments, constructively. He brought the story into department trainings, not as a story about a villain and a hero, but as a case study in what happens when assumption is allowed to substitute for information. How easily a phone call rooted in unexamined bias could have escalated, in 1,000 other towns, into something far worse than an awkward wedding interruption. He talked about how close it had come to being that kind of story too, how the only thing standing between a bad assumption and a genuinely dangerous outcome had been two young officers who, thankfully, chose to listen before they acted, and a badge in his own jacket pocket that he was lucky enough to have the standing to produce. Not everyone got to walk away from a moment like that with an apology and a dance floor. He knew that better than almost anyone. A year later, on their first anniversary, Marcus and Jasmine held a small dinner on the same porch where he'd proposed. Miss Pat baked the same recipe of cornbread she'd served at the wedding, and somewhere in the middle of the evening, as the sun dropped low over the same lawn where the tent had once stood, a knock came at the door. It was Sandra, holding a plate of cookies, asking, for the first time in 7 years of living beside them, if she could come in and say a proper congratulations. Jasmine opened the door, and after a long pause, she stepped aside and let her in. It wasn't a perfect ending, and nobody pretended it was. Trust, once broken by assumption, doesn't rebuild itself in a single conversation or a single plate of cookies. But it was a start, and sometimes a start is the most honest kind of hope a story can offer. Marcus liked to say that the badge in his pocket that night hadn't once been the most important thing he was carrying. The most important thing had been the choice, in the middle of his own wedding, to turn a moment of humiliation into a moment of teaching, instead of letting bitterness plant itself somewhere it didn't belong. Jasmine liked to say that the real story was never about the police at all. It was about a neighborhood and a town, and maybe a country, slowly learning the difference between a stranger and a threat, one uncomfortable, necessary conversation at a time. And if there's one thing worth carrying away from a night that started with red and blue lights and ended with a dance floor full of laughter, it might be this. The assumptions we make about people we'd never bothered to know say far more about us than they ever will about them. Millbrook didn't become a perfect town overnight, but it became, in its own slow and imperfect way, a little more like the kind of place Marcus and Jasmine had always hoped to build a life in together. One where a knock on the door came before a call to the police, and where grace, more often than not, got the last word.